Back live tonight here in Focus, and thanks for staying on. 6 people have been killed in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. This follows a dispute between the state armed forces and pro-government militia in the volatile Mugerwa region. The killings come after clashes with M23 rebels erupted last month, breaking several months of relative calm in the eastern region. By late 2021, the Tutsi-led M23 militia seized swaths of territory since launching an offensive, driving more than 1 million people from their homes. To help us understand the dispute and what the future holds ahead of the December general elections, we're now joined by Faith Mabera, a senior researcher with the Institute for Global Dialogue. Faith, good to have you, and thank you very much for coming on.
Good evening. Good evening to the listeners.
So we are watching what's happening in Israel, and previously we were talking about what was happening between Russia and Ukraine, and all sorts of words being thrown around. Genocide is one particular word. Is it possible that we could be, or we could have been actually seeing a genocide unfolding for many months in the DRC, yet the world has been turning a blind eye on it?
Thank you, Thabo. I think it's important to place conflict situations in context, and a use of a term such as genocide has certain connotations that come with it. So I would be careful in sort of employing it in such a context, particularly because if you tend to sort of direct it in a particular context, you tend to dilute its meaning for such a loaded term. So I'd rather maybe stick to the term that we've been seeing, the cycle of violence that we've been seeing in the Eastern DRC, which in effect is linked to a lot of the structural dynamics, a lot of the history, the broader Great Lakes region, and also the underlying drivers and local drivers and causes of conflict that inform not only the DRC but the Great Lakes. So I would be careful about employing that term in that particular context, because you tend to then sort of reduce it to and sort of temper down the weight that it's supposed to carry. So I think for the purposes of this discussion, I think let us just employ the term that has been used, either conflict or crisis. Conflict or crisis.
All right, let's look at that conflict or crisis. Is that conflict or crisis getting a fair attention compared to other conflicts that have certainly been given the spotlight?
I'd pose the same question to you. Is the conflict in Sudan getting equal media attention as what we've seen perhaps with the Russia-Ukraine one, or even the situation in Gaza? It all points to the role of narratives and who's the purveyor of such narratives. And this is particularly why some would argue, some analysts have argued, that the conflicts in that have been ongoing for decades, for instance, the one in Eastern DRC and the one that has occurred in cycles such as the one in Sudan, has sort of been relegated to the back burner as opposed to, for instance, the situation in Russia and Ukraine. It points down to the role of geopolitical sort of leanings that catapult this particular conflict to the top of the agenda, and the actors and stakeholders that some would argue of particular interest or particular narrative in pushing forward that particular conflict. So yes, I agree with you that we've seen a neglect, not only from the media attention, but the world attention has also been divided, given the scale of crisis that we've been seeing playing across not only the African continent, but also across the globe. So it's fair to say that, yes, there has been attention lacking, particularly in that regard.
Yeah. Is it helpful in the context of the DRC conflict to look at it in the dichotomy of the aggressor and a victim, almost? There's one who's being oppressed and there's one who is the oppressor. Does it work that way, or is it a different kind of setup?
It tends, if you sort of lob it into such binaries, you tend to advance a very reductionist view of the conflict. For instance, as you rightfully stated at the beginning of the segment, the most recent iteration of crisis in Eastern DRC has been prompted by the resurgence of the M23 rebel group. And interestingly, the capture of Goma by M23 in 2021 is what sort of catapulted it to notoriety at the time. And after an intense military operation by the DRC and other regional workers, we saw its presence sort of being diminished significantly. But it seems that they sort of regrouped and have now advanced a more vicious campaign, which is what we're seeing playing now. And with the deployment of the East African Regional Force in November 2022, it was hoped that a ceasefire would hold. So there was a bit of a lull in fighting, and we saw the M23 sort of scaling back to their regional positions in North Kivu, and also scaling back from Goma, the capital of North Kivu province. But subsequently, what has happened is that the various ceasefires have been broken. And in fact, there is an argument to be made that the political stability in that region is increasingly tied to the imminent elections that are set to happen in the DRC in December 2023. Controversial, particularly around the safety of civilians and the larger question about whether you can really have free and fair elections in the context of an ongoing crisis. And then add to that, the situation is further compounded by the kind of regional scale and geopolitical tensions that come with the crisis in Eastern DRC. So the fear that a lot of analysts have had, including myself, is that the deployment of the East African Regional Force, for instance, and the composition of that force with various countries, including the DRC's own neighbors, perhaps would be used as a platform to advance their own interests in the economic and geopolitical and regional interests in sort of getting involved in that particular crisis. And I think this is what is coming to the fore with the latest developments, the renewed violence that we've been seeing against civilians, the renewed skirmishes between the M23 and the various forces, and the growing discontent with the security situation and the discontent with also the presence of the UN peacekeeping force in Congo.
What are some of the legacy issues? What are the historic drivers of this conflict, and have they morphed throughout the various iterations of it into other drivers?
I think at the core, one would argue that a lot of the DRC's internal strife has been linked to its base geostrategic location at the heart of Africa, the kind of mineral wealth that it holds, and the various stakeholders who are locked in contest, not only for territory, but for also grabbing a hold or getting us a bit of stake in the DRC's very rich resource base. So that's, I think, is one that we need to bear in mind. Now, add to that the kind of fragmented landscape that we have in terms of, from a political perspective. The ethnicization of politics has also fueled cycles of violence within the DRC. And as I said, this is tied larger to the power, the question of the struggle for power, the struggle for control over the economic resources, and then add to that this idea of extending regional spheres of influence by various stakeholders in the Great Lakes region. So right from the Congo wars, right from also the involvement of various actors in the Great Lakes region, such as the historic animosity that exists between Kinshasa and Kigali, is one that has also constantly featured as a key driver of insecurity and instability in Eastern DRC and the Greater Lakes region.
Yeah. Well, regional stakes, of course, that would include other players, and I'm sure would include some other international players who are at play as well. But let's start with the territorial contestation. Who are the local players? Who are the drivers of that?
So in terms of territory, so it depends if you're trying to now really narrow down on the question of the Eastern DRC as from the perspective of the current conflagration with the M23, or if you're talking about broader insecurity that the DRC has been facing historically. So if you're talking about the latest iteration, like I said, you can't sort of extricate it from the broader context. So from a territorial perspective, the I think proximate cause for for the latest unrest was this agreement between Uganda and DRC that allowed the deployment of Ugandan troops to fight the Allied Defense Forces in Eastern DRC. And coupled with that now, as I mentioned, the resurgence of M23 and the threat that it could take over Goma then prompted an additional and a more robust attention on the matter. And this is what, of course, spurred the deployment of the East African Regional Force. So it centers around Eastern DRC's, as I said, the mineral wealth, but also at stake is power politics, the mutual politics also of destabilization that occurs presently in the Eastern DRC. So take an actor, for instance, I've already talked about Rwanda. Take an actor, for instance, at Burundi, which so happens to also be a contributor to the East African Regional Force. Not only does Burundi share a border with the DRC, but also the Burundian question is interesting because Burundi also has interest in addressing or countering some rebel forces, the Red Tabara rebel group that is also hostile against the regime in Bujumbura. So they have an interest in also pursuing a military solution and pursuing operations on Congolese territory. For instance. Then coupled with that, the M23 group, as part of some of their core concerns and grievances, which the viewers want to understand, for instance, has been they've long wanted a stop or a halt to the persecution of what they deem as the Tutsi minority population in Eastern DRC, but also they wanted clear terms in terms of incorporation of former rebels of their own ranks into a reconfigured Congolese state. So those two elements now, notwithstanding and not having been met, is what has continuously fueled their grievance with the regime in Kinshasa. So those are just a bit of a snapshot of the underlying logic. Of course, I'm reducing it to very simple terms just for in the interest of time, but there's larger issues that become very interlocked and enmeshed within questions of politicized identity, questions of territory, geopolitics, and regional tensions. All this, I think, are key drivers that have fueled the instability in not only DRC, but Eastern DRC, but also in broader pockets across the country.
Yeah. On that question of geopolitics, I mean, to some extent, would you say there are maybe in other instances, maybe not all, some proxy wars that are being fought for some international players?
Yes. So I've mentioned the two actors who are part of the East African Regional Force, but of course, in context, that means that there's also other key players. So aside from the East African Regional Force, we know that also earlier this year in July, that SADC also wanted to deploy its own regional force to tackle particularly the issue of the M23 resurgence. But let's not forget that there has been a decades-long UN presence in Eastern DRC to try and also not only address the issue of the armed groups, but to also protect and ensure that the transitional process, the political transitional process, that peace is secured. And there's an argument to be made that they've not been effective in delivering security as a public good to the Congolese civilian population, particularly. So these are some of the elements that have been going on. And of course, you have to situate that within the various political actors, yes, but who also come attended by economic actors who want a stake in the Congolese mineral wealth. So they come as a unit, one can argue. And by virtue of the location of Congo where it is, then that means that inevitably drawing its neighbors. This is where, for instance, the question with Rwanda is interesting. The also resurgence of various extremist groups such as ADF, which has been a thorn on the side of Kampala, is also interesting. As I mentioned, Burundi is also tackling rebel groups that established a presence in eastern DRC. So that pocket of unrest in the eastern DRC has proved to be a linchpin, particularly in the approaches and the security policies of the various regional actors in the region. And that, by implication, means that you ultimately have to look at it from a lens also of geopolitics alongside, as in the structural and local drivers of conflict.
Yeah. In terms of resources, I mean, we see what the UN has been putting out as far as resources has been concerned in other conflicts that we're seeing in the world, amounting to billions and billions of US dollars, and armory and so on and so forth. Has there been a similar kind of dispersing of resources in this conflict?
I'm not sure I understand your question. So this dispersion of resources among the stakeholders with interest, or in terms of economics trickle benefit? Just clarify the question.
No, amongst the stakeholders with interest in particular.
I think that's where the contestation comes in, because the greater stake you have, the greater interest you have in ensuring that the political economy that of violence continues or persists.
Yeah.
So those with greater stakes, some would argue a lot of the Western actors who've historically been involved in the mining and extractive sector, for instance, would not want to see their share diminished, despite a rhetoric about shared profits, shared investment with the local authorities. I think talk is one thing and action on the ground is other. So it's ultimately the question of greed, the question of power politics, and the question of the political economy of violence and war profiteering that I think is a key element that has fueled a lot of the conflict in DRC. So on paper and in terms of in one hand, in terms of service to public discourse, they would obviously state that they have an interest in ensuring that the local population or the government, for instance, benefits from their own mineral wealth. But I think in reality, given contestations for capital, for power, it's a very different argument and a very different reality on the ground. So I wouldn't be so fast to sort of say that, yes, there's been a fair distribution of resources. Not at all. I think the ones who profit much are those, for instance, who are in bed with the local, and even the elite, for instance, would stand to gain from ensuring that the largesse is also directed in for instance, to the various capitals. They also have a stake in ensuring that flow is sustained in the long term. So greed is central here. Profiteering from instability, but also the links to capital and the levers around capital, I think, are important elements to understand.
In terms of timing, would you say there is a particular link between the latest iteration of the conflict and the December general elections?
Yes. So in terms of the actual occurrence, that was linked to, some have argued that it was at the behest of, and here there's been allegations that there was a lot of clandestine involvement, and some would argue forthright involvement by the Kigali government in ensuring that there is continued instability, hence their funding that has been directed to arming the M23 government. But also there has been rumors on the grapevine that Tshisekedi is keen to reassert his control over territory. He's keen to paint himself as a strongman who's been able to contain the various armed groups that are roaming freely in eastern DRC. So he's keen to retain his seat in power. As to whether the conditions on the ground are actually conducive for the holding of elections is an entirely different matter. As I've mentioned, how legitimate is it to hold elections in the context of violence, in the context of people, civilians being killed, in the context of also a very fragmented oppositional landscape in DRC. One would argue how fair would such a political context turn out to be in the long run. So that is what we are seeing playing out now. But in the context of the breakdown of the political agenda and the breakdown of ceasefires that were supposed to hold. I think it speaks to the larger cycle of violence that I've mentioned. So when you have politicized identity and ethnicity on one hand, and you morph that with the larger question of the structural violence and various external actors with very geostrategic interests in DRC, they would also have a stake in ensuring that the instability, for instance, continues. So it's a very precarious security situation that we find ourselves in the eastern DRC, and whether the insistence, for instance, on holding of elections it's a very symbolic move that would benefit to send a particular message for a very small group of pandering to the wider gallery or the international community gallery that the DRC piece is holding, but it's a very negative piece, as we've seen, and it's certainly going to set the stage for more cycles of renewed violence, as opposed to the stability that elections are supposed, for instance, to embody.
Faith Mabera, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for your analysis this evening, Senior Researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue.